Let us see what man would want you after this. There. Now we'll see what your fine Baron thinks of you.
In the gray hush before a prairie sunrise, Lady Eleanor forces Mary down onto her knees in the dirt beside the fence post, one fist wound tight in the thick rope of her auburn braid. The straight razor catches the first pale thread of dawn. "Let's see," Eleanor says, soft as a threat, "if your precious Baron still comes calling for a bald-headed sow." The first braid falls to the dust like something severed from the world. The razor scraped a final pass across Mary's scalp, and Eleanor stepped back to admire her work with the satisfaction of a woman who had just won something. "There," she said, dropping the severed braid into the dirt. "Now we'll see what your fine Baron thinks of you." Mary did not move. The morning dew soaked through the knees of her dress, and the prairie wind, still cold at this hour, moved freely across her bare skull for the first time in her life. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs to keep them from shaking. Eleanor swept back toward the house, her skirts catching the dust. In the tree line, Gideon Sterling had not moved. His horse shifted beneath him, restless, but he held it still with one quiet hand. His jaw was set. His eyes did not leave Mary, still kneeling, still upright, unbroken in the dirt. She had learned, early, that the kitchen was both her prison and her sanctuary. The Harthaway farmhouse sat at the edge of a long, flat stretch of Missouri bottomland. Good soil, her father had always said, rich enough to make a man's fortune if he worked it honest. Thomas Harthaway had worked it honest. He had also loved his daughter honestly, called her brilliant, read to her from every book the traveling merchants brought through, and believed with the stubborn conviction of a frontier man that Mary would one day be the finest mind in the county. Then he died, and Eleanor moved the books to the attic and Mary to the kitchen. That had been 6 years ago. Mary was 24 now, and the kitchen was her world in the way that a cage is a world, complete, functional, and entirely without horizon. She rose before the sun. That was the first rule of her existence, unspoken but absolute. The fire needed building, the bread needed setting, the water needed hauling from the well before Eleanor's daughters stirred in their soft beds upstairs. Helena and Lydia took their breakfast at 8, arranged prettily at the long oak table like ornaments on a shelf, while Mary ate standing at the counter, if she ate at all before the noon hour. Eleanor never said outright that Mary was a servant. She was far too precise a woman for bluntness. Instead, she worked in suggestions, in the architecture of daily life, in the way she arranged things so that the conclusion was inevitable. When the farmhands, Nell and Bramble, were given the lighter outdoor work, it was simply because Mary was so capable in the kitchen. When the bolts of new fabric arrived from St. Louis, pale blue for Helena, rose silk for Lydia, Eleanor would look at Mary with something almost resembling regret and say that certain cuts simply did not flatter certain figures, that it was kinder not to try. Mary had a figure that Eleanor treated as a personal affront. She was a large woman. She had known it since girlhood, had heard it discussed at church socials and county gatherings with the frank indelicacy that frontier people reserved for weather and livestock. Too big, heavy-boned, a shame really, because her face was handsome enough. Eleanor had refined this community assessment into a precise instrument of control, deploying it in small surgical moments, a pointed glance when Mary reached for a second helping, a murmured word to a neighbor about Mary's condition, the way Eleanor would sigh deeply whenever Mary moved through a room, as though her very presence constituted an imposition on the air. She had internalized it. That was the cruelest part, and she knew it was cruel even as it happened, the way you can watch a hook sink into your own skin and still be unable to pull free. She moved through the house with the apologetic carefulness of someone who believed she took up too much space. She turned sideways in doorways that were wide enough. She waited for rooms to empty before she crossed them. She had learned to make herself small in all the ways that mattered, even while her body refused to cooperate. And yet, in the kitchen, alone before dawn with the fire catching and the bread dough turning under her hands, something in her refused to entirely disappear. She thought about the letters her father had written her, stored now in the hollow of a fence post she had never told Eleanor about. She recited quietly the passages of philosophy and natural science she had memorized before the books went to the attic. She watched through the single kitchen window the slow machinery of the seasons working across her father's land that was hers by right, though Eleanor had long since buried that particular fact beneath layers of grief and paperwork and quiet assumption. She was not, in those private hours, the woman Eleanor had constructed. She was Thomas Harthaway's daughter. She was sharp and curious and capable of fury. She was simply waiting, without quite knowing it, for something to make the waiting worth it. The letters found her on a Tuesday, the way most consequential things find you, sideways while you were looking for something else entirely. She had been searching for the spare harness buckle Bramble needed for the east fence repair, rooting through the cluttered shelf above the pantry where Thomas Harthaway had kept his miscellaneous ironwork and forgotten tools. Her fingers found a bundle before they found the buckle, a stack of papers tied with kitchen string, pressed flat between an old seed catalog and the wall, in the particular deliberate way of something hidden rather than merely stored. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized why she recognized it. Fine, forward slanting letters, the ink gone brownish with age. Julian Vane had always pressed too hard with his pen. Her father had teased him about it once at a harvest supper when Julian was 16 and Mary was 15 and the world had not yet arranged itself into its current cruelties. She counted 9 letters. She read them standing at the pantry shelf, not moving, not breathing with any particular regularity, while the bread she had set to prove sat forgotten on the counter behind her. The earliest was dated the spring after her father's funeral. Julian wrote with the careful formality of a young man trying to sound older than his grief, expressing his condolences, asking after Mary's welfare, noting that he had called at the house twice and been told both times that she was unwell and not receiving visitors. He hoped she would write when she was recovered. He remained sincerely her friend. The second letter came 6 weeks later, more uncertain in tone, slightly wounded at the edges. He had heard from Helena, his childhood friend, his neighbor, that Mary was in good health. He did not understand the discrepancy. He asked again if he had given offense. The third letter was angrier, not at Mary, but at the silence, which he had apparently decided was its own kind of answer. By the fifth letter, something had shifted. The salutation had cooled from Dear Mary to Miss Harthaway. He wrote of a cousin in St. Louis he intended to visit. He wrote of how time had a way of clarifying things. He wrote, in the careful language of a young man sealing a door he had kept open too long, that he wished her every happiness. The 9th letter was the shortest, 3 lines. He was to be married in the autumn. He thought she ought to know in case the news reached her through other means. He did not sign it with his full name. Mary set the letters down on the shelf with the same careful precision with which she set her father's china, as though roughness now might shatter something that had already been broken for years. Eleanor had taken this from her, not in a single dramatic act, not with a razor or a public shaming, but in the patient, methodical way she took everything, answering doors, intercepting the post, constructing a version of Mary that the world received in place of the real one, a Mary who was unwell, a Mary who did not respond, a Mary too heavy with grief or with her own body to be worth pursuing.
Julian Vane had married a woman from St. Louis. He had 3 children now, she had heard. He still visited Helena sometimes, and he was always perfectly civil when he passed Mary in the yard, the practiced civility of a man who had made his peace. She had always thought his coolness was indifference. She had worn it as confirmation of everything Eleanor had ever implied about her worth. She stood in the pantry for a long time after that, her hand resting on the stack of letters, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house, Lydia's footsteps overhead, the creak of the pump in the yard, the distant low of the cattle at the fence line. Her father's land, her father's house, her father's letters, stolen and cached like trophies above the pantry shelf. The fury she had kept quietly banked for 6 years shifted in her chest like a coal finding new air.
The county fair came 3 days later, as though the world had decided to offer her something before she could decide what to do with her anger. Baron Gideon Sterling had organized it with the methodical generosity of a man who understood that prosperity was communal or it was nothing. There were livestock competitions and a seed exchange, a fiddle contest that drew families from as far as the Cowboy settlement, long tables of preserves and pies judged by the circuit preacher with solemn impartiality. The whole of the bottomland county turned out, dressed in its best approximation of its best, and the fairground on the Sterling property shimmered in the late August heat like something from a different world entirely. Eleanor had dressed Helena in the pale blue and Lydia in the rose silk. Mary wore her Sunday dress, which was clean and well mended and 3 years out of fashion, and Eleanor had looked at her in it with the particular expression that required no words. They rode to the fairground in the Harthaway wagon, Eleanor in the front beside Nell's husband who drove, the sisters behind her like a small display, and Mary on the rear bench with the basket of preserves Eleanor was entering under the Harthaway name. Preserves Mary had made entirely, from fruit Mary had picked in the hours before dawn when the rest of the house was still sleeping. She did not say this. She had learned the arithmetic of which battles cost more than they returned. The fairground was loud and golden and smelled of hay and fry bread and horses, and despite everything, despite the letters still burning a hole in her thinking, Mary felt something loosen in her chest when they arrived. She loved crowds the way introverts sometimes secretly love them, from a useful distance, observing, reading the small theater of human interaction with the pleasure of someone who has had a great deal of practice being invisible. She was crossing behind the livestock pens, carrying the empty preserve basket back to the wagon, when the wagon wheel found her. Not their wagon, a stranger's, a heavy supply rig that had been badly parked on a slope and chose that precise moment to shift. The wheel caught the ground wrong, the whole rig lurched sideways, and Mary stepped back to avoid it, caught her heel on a wagon tongue half buried in the trampled grass, and went down hard on the packed earth. The basket skittered away, her palms hit the ground. She lay still for a moment in the particular stunned dignity of someone cataloging their injuries before deciding whether to be embarrassed. "Are you hurt?" The voice was even, unhurried, with the quality of a man accustomed to assessing situations before reacting to them. She looked up. Baron Gideon Sterling was crouching beside her, not the posture of a man performing concern, but the genuine crouch of someone actually checking, his dark eyes moving over her with the same practical attention he probably gave a fence line or a soil sample. "My pride, primarily," Mary said, before she could decide whether it was wise. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. He offered his hand. She took it, and he pulled her upright with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who worked his own land regardless of his title. "Gideon Sterling," he said. "I know who you are." She retrieved the basket. "Mary Harthaway." Thomas Harthaway's daughter? It was not a question, and the way he said her father's name, with simple, unadorned respect, undid something in her she had not expected. "He was a good man. I was sorry to hear of his passing."
She looked at him directly then, which she rarely did with anyone. He was perhaps 30, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of a man who spent more time in his fields than his parlor, and he was looking back at her with an attention that was entirely uncomplicated by the usual inventory men performed on women at county gatherings. He was, she said, the best I knew. "Tell me about him," Gideon said, and turned to walk beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. And somehow, improbably, on a loud golden afternoon that smelled of fry bread and hay, she did.
If you want to find out what happens next between Mary and the Baron, make sure you subscribe and hit the like button. We release new chapters every week, and trust us, you do not want to miss what's coming.
They walked for nearly an hour. Mary had not talked about her father, truly talked, not the performative grief that social occasions sometimes required, in longer than she could accurately measure. But Gideon asked questions the way a good farmer reads land, with patience and genuine curiosity, and she found herself telling him things she had not told anyone. About the books Thomas had collected, about the way he had taught her to read a weather system from the behavior of the cattle, about his theory, which he had held with quiet stubbornness until his last year, that the bottomland soil could sustain wheat if the drainage was managed correctly. Gideon stopped walking at that. "He was right," he said. "I've been trialing it on the North Quarter for 2 seasons. The drainage is the whole problem and the whole solution." He looked at her with the focused attention of a man recalibrating something. How did he propose to manage it? She told him. She had the details memorized from a conversation at the kitchen table when she was 17, her father sketching drainage channels on the back of an old bill of sale. Gideon listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone genuinely thinking rather than merely waiting to speak. "That's a better approach than what I've been doing," he said simply. It was, she realized, the first time in 6 years that anyone had told her she was right about something. She might have said more. There was more to say. She had 6 years of compressed thinking stored in the hours before dawn, observations about the land and the seasons, and the way the water table shifted in dry years, all of it unspoken because there had been no one worth speaking it to. But the hand closed around her upper arm before she heard the footsteps, and Eleanor's voice arrived like a blade finding a gap in armor. "Mary, there you are." The tone was warmth itself, the practiced warmth of a woman performing relief for an audience. Eleanor's eyes moved over the scene with the speed and precision of a surveyor, taking in Gideon's posture, the easy proximity of their conversation, the absence of Helena and Lydia, and arriving at a conclusion that tightened something behind her smile. "I have been looking everywhere for you, dear heart. Nell needs the basket." She drew Mary sideways with the gentle firmness of someone steering livestock, her grip on Mary's arm absolute beneath the social softness of the gesture. "Baron Sterling, what a wonderful event you have organized. Truly, the whole county is in your debt." Gideon inclined his head. His eyes tracked Mary's face for a fraction of a second before returning to Eleanor with the polite neutrality of a man who had registered something and chosen to file it carefully. Eleanor released Mary with a small pat that was also a dismissal and turned her full attention on Gideon like a lamp being angled towards its subject. "I don't believe you have spent any real time with my daughters. Helena, come here, sweetheart." She produced Helena from somewhere with the smooth efficiency of a conjurer, rose-cheeked and perfectly dressed, followed closely by Lydia, who arrived with the bright, practiced vivacity of a girl who had been told since childhood that her greatest asset was her smile, and had decided to get her money's worth from it. Mary walked back toward the wagon alone. She did not look behind her. She could hear Eleanor's voice, musical and carrying, describing Helena's accomplishments to Gideon with the enthusiasm of a merchant displaying premium goods. She set the basket in the wagon bed and stood with her hands resting on the sideboard, looking out over the fairground, the noise and color of it, the ordinary happiness of other people moving through an ordinary afternoon. Behind her, she heard Gideon's voice cut cleanly through Eleanor's performance. Miss Harthaway mentioned her father's drainage theory. I wonder if I might call at the farm tomorrow morning to discuss it further. A beat of silence, very brief, very full. Of course, Eleanor said. We would be delighted.
Eleanor did not sleep that night. Mary could tell by the quality of the silence in the house, too alert, too deliberate, the silence of a woman lying in the dark making calculations. Mary slept poorly herself, but for different reasons. She lay in her narrow room off the kitchen and thought about drainage channels and wheat yields and the precise, unhurried way Gideon Sterling had said, "That's a better approach than what I've been doing," as though her knowledge were simply a fact to be acknowledged rather than a surprise to be managed. She thought about the 9 letters in the pantry, still bundled with kitchen string. She thought about her father's land spreading out in the darkness beyond the window, patient and indifferent, and entirely unaware that it was no longer hers in any way that the law would currently recognize. She was at the fire before 4, earlier than usual, as though her body understood that the day required extra preparation. She was setting the bread when she heard Eleanor's door. Not the girl's. Eleanor's step was different, purposeful, fully shod, moving through the house with the brisk energy of someone who had been awake for hours and was finished waiting. She came into the kitchen already dressed, her hair pinned, carrying the straight razor from Thomas's old shaving kit in one hand and a length of kitchen twine in the other. Mary turned from the fire. Eleanor looked at her with an expression that was almost, in its terrible way, compassionate, the look of a woman doing something she had convinced herself was practical rather than cruel. "Sit down, Mary." "What is that for?" "Sit down." The voice that had charmed Gideon Sterling at the fairground yesterday was entirely absent. This was the voice Eleanor used before dawn, when there was no one to perform for. "You made a fool of yourself yesterday, hanging on a man's arm at a public gathering, filling his head with your father's nonsense. Do you have any idea how you looked?" Mary did not sit. "He asked me questions." He was being polite. Eleanor set the twine on the counter with a small, precise click. "Men like Gideon Sterling do not call on women like you, Mary. They do not. And I will not have you embarrassing this household by imagining otherwise." She moved closer, and something in her eyes had the flat quality of a decision already made and therefore no longer open to discussion. He is coming here this morning with his polite questions, and when he arrives, he will find Helena and Lydia, who are actually worth his time, and he will find you in the kitchen where you belong, looking exactly like what you are. I won't sit down. Eleanor was faster than she looked. She had always been faster than she looked. The hand caught Mary's shoulder and turned her with a force that had years of practice behind it, and then the twine was around the thick rope of Mary's braid, and Eleanor had her pressed against the fence post before the cold air of the yard had fully registered. The first stroke of the razor was decisive. Eleanor had not come here to hesitate. Mary closed her eyes. The prairie wind was sharp this morning, coming off the river, and she could hear the cattle moving at the far fence, and the first birds starting in the tree line, and the soft, brutal sound of her hair coming away in Eleanor's fist. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. She did not beg. She had known from the moment Eleanor walked into the kitchen that begging would cost more than silence and return nothing. The razor made its final pass. Eleanor stepped back. "Now," she said, dropping the braid into the dirt with the indifference of someone discarding a vegetable peel, "let's see if your Baron still comes calling." She swept back toward the house. The door closed.
Mary knelt in the dirt in the gray and rising light, the wind moving cold and strange across her bare skull, and looked at her reflection in the water trough beside the post, a woman she almost did not recognize, kneeling in the dust of her father's yard. In the tree line, a horse shifted. A hand held it still.
She did not hear him approach. She heard the horse first, the soft, deliberate sound of hooves on damp grass being walked slowly, the way a man rides when he does not want to startle something fragile. Then the creak of the fence gate, and then his boots on the stone path, and Mary realized with a dull, distant clarity that she had not moved from the water trough, and that it was too late to move now. She straightened her spine. It was the only dignity available to her, and she took it. Gideon Sterling came around the corner of the fence and stopped. He took in the scene with the same unhurried assessment he had turned on her at the fairground. Not the frozen, wide-eyed appraisal of a man encountering something shocking, but the still, focused attention of a man understanding something completely. His eyes moved from Mary to the braid in the dirt, to the razor lying on the fence post ledge, and then back to Mary. His jaw set in the way she would come to know meant he was mastering something he did not intend to perform in front of anyone. He crossed the yard to her in 8 even strides. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say anything immediately, which she was grateful for, because she was not certain she could have maintained her composure against sympathy delivered at close range. Instead, he reached up and removed his hat, a good hat, dark felt, the kind of hat a man replaces reluctantly when it finally wears out, and placed it gently on her bare head with the matter-of-fact care of someone performing an entirely reasonable and obvious action. It settled over her ears. It was too large, and it was warm from his head, and Mary looked up at him from beneath its brim and found she had absolutely nothing to say. "The orchard," Gideon said. "You mentioned yesterday that your father planted it the first year on the property. I'd like to see it if you're willing to show me." She stared at him. "I'm early, I acknowledge that. I apologize for that." She stopped, started again. "The orchard is behind the south pasture. Lead the way," he said, and waited. She led the way. They were halfway across the south pasture when the back door of the farmhouse opened and Lydia's voice carried across the morning air, bright and startled. "Baron Sterling! Oh, we didn't expect you yet. Helena isn't even—" A pause, during which Mary imagined Lydia taking in the scene, the Baron in his shirt sleeves crossing the pasture beside the shorn, red-eyed kitchen daughter, and recalibrating rapidly. Shall we—" "Miss Lydia." Gideon's voice was pleasant and final as a closed gate. "Please tell your mother I'll call at the house afterward. Miss Harthaway is showing me the orchard." The door closed. They walked on. The orchard was Thomas Harthaway's best work, and Mary knew it. 12 apple trees and 4 pears planted in the rich bottomland soil, grown now into a proper canopy, the late summer fruit just beginning to color. Mary walked him through it the way her father had walked her through it, naming each variety, explaining the rootstock choices, pointing out where Thomas had grafted 2 varieties onto a single trunk in an experiment that had worked beyond anyone's expectations. Gideon listened the way he had listened at the fair, completely without performance. "He grafted these himself?" he asked, examining the union point on the trunk with genuine interest. "She taught me how. I've done 3 more since he died." She pointed to the younger trees at the orchard's edge. "Those." Gideon looked at the trees for a long moment, then looked at her, really looked, the way almost no one did, without the usual social filtration of what they expected to see. The hat had slipped sideways. She must have looked, she thought, fairly ridiculous. He straightened it gently with one hand. "Your father was right about the wheat drainage, and he was right about the grafting. He was clearly right about a great deal." He said it simply, looking at the orchard, and Mary understood that he was not talking only about the trees. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Eleanor said nothing directly. She was too precise a woman for direct objection when indirect management was still available. But the household reorganized itself around Gideon's visits with the subtle urgency of a military operation. Helena appeared at breakfast fully dressed and composed in a way that suggested she had been awake since before Mary lit the fire.
Lydia stationed herself on the porch with embroidery she demonstrably did not know how to do. Eleanor herself materialized at the yard gate each morning with the reliable punctuality of a toll-keeper, bright and welcoming, directing Gideon toward the parlor and the good coffee, and the daughters arranged prettily within. Gideon was courteous to all of it. He accepted the coffee, exchanged the required pleasantries, admired whatever Helena had been positioned to display that morning. And then he asked, with the same pleasant finality he had used at the back door on the first morning, where Miss Harthaway was. He found her in the kitchen, or the garden, or the east field where she had been checking the drainage channels her father had originally mapped. Wherever she was, he came there. Eleanor watched this pattern establish itself over 3 days with an expression Mary had never seen on her face before. The expression of a woman whose instrument is not producing the expected note and cannot identify why. They talked about everything. That was what Mary had not anticipated, not the visits themselves, which she had half convinced herself would stop, but the breadth of what there was to say once someone was genuinely listening. They talked about the wheat trial on Gideon's north quarter and the drainage modification she had suggested, which he had already begun implementing. They talked about soil amendment and crop rotation and the particular challenges of bottomland farming in dry years. They talked about a book on agricultural philosophy he had read over the winter, and she told him she had read it too, her father's copy, before Eleanor sent it to the attic, and they disagreed, productively and at length, about the 3rd chapter. "You think he's wrong about fallow periods," Gideon said on the 4th morning, leaning against the orchard fence with his hat on his own head for once, since Mary had returned it the 2nd day, with more reluctance than she had expected. "I think he's working from English soil data and applying it to American conditions without sufficient adjustment," Mary said. "Fallow makes sense in a saturated climate. Out here, it's just lost yield." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Write that argument out, properly. I want to read it." She looked at him. "You have the reasoning, the full case. I've watched you work through it over 3 days. Write it out." No one had asked her to write anything since her father died. The request landed somewhere tender, and she looked away toward the tree line for a moment before she trusted her expression. She wrote it that evening at the kitchen table after supper, in the hour between the washing up and the point at which exhaustion became non-negotiable. 4 pages, careful and argued. She had expected the act of writing it to feel strange from disuse. Instead, it felt like finding a tool she had set down years ago and discovering her hand still knew the grip. He read it the following morning at the orchard fence, standing, unhurried, while she pretended to check the lower branches for codling moth. When he finished, he folded it with the care of a document worth keeping. "This is good thinking," he said. "This is genuinely good thinking, Mary." It was the first time he had used her given name. He noticed, and knew that he knew she had noticed, and neither of them remarked on it. But something had changed in the week's careful architecture, and they both understood what it was. She was not, in his eyes, the Harthaway problem, the oversized, overlooked, inconvenient woman Eleanor had constructed from 6 years of patient diminishment. She was the person who had read the 3rd chapter and found the flaw in the argument. She was beginning, slowly and with considerable resistance from old habit, to consider that he might be right. The dinner was Eleanor's idea, which meant it was Eleanor's trap. She announced it on Friday with the gracious spontaneity of a woman who had been planning it since Monday. A formal supper at the Harthaway table, the Baron invited, Julian Vane and Alistair Finch included to round out the company, Helena and Lydia in their best dresses. Mary was informed that she would serve. She understood the architecture immediately.
Julian Vane at the table, Julian, whose 9 letters sat in the pantry, whose silence Mary had worn for 6 years as evidence of her own unworthiness, placed directly in Gideon's sightline. The implication required no elaboration. Here is a man who considered her and declined. Here is the verdict of men with options. Here is what the market has already determined. Mary set the table and said nothing. The evening assembled itself with Eleanor's characteristic precision. The parlor was lit warmly, the good dishes produced, Helena positioned to pour and Lydia to charm. Gideon arrived punctually and was received in the parlor with the full performance of Harthaway hospitality, Eleanor at her most practiced and luminous, the daughters arranged like an argument. Julian Vane arrived with the careful civility of a man who had made his peace with a situation and intended to keep it. Alistair Finch arrived because he went wherever Julian went. Mary moved between kitchen and dining room with the plates, invisible in the way she had spent 6 years perfecting. She had almost made it through the soup course when Eleanor struck. It was, like all of Eleanor's best cruelties, framed as concern. She waited for a moment of general conversation lull, and then she said lightly, addressing the table at large, "I do worry about Mary, I confess. She works so hard and asks for so little. Though I sometimes wonder," a small, sorrowful pause, "whether she hasn't let herself go rather beyond what's healthy. Julian, you knew her as a girl. You'd hardly recognize her now, I think." Julian went very still. Alistair studied his soup. Eleanor turned in her chair to where Mary stood at the sideboard and performed a long, soft, pitying appraisal, moving from Mary's face down and back up, slowly enough to constitute a verdict. "And then this business with her hair," she sighed. "She cut it herself, if you can believe it. Some kind of episode. We've been very concerned." The table was silent. Gideon set down his spoon. He did it without urgency, the way he did everything, with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided what he is going to do and sees no reason to perform the deciding. He folded his napkin and placed it beside his bowl and pushed back his chair and stood. "Mrs. Harthaway," his voice was even and absolute and filled the room without effort. "I was in the tree line the morning Miss Harthaway's hair was cut. I arrived early for my visit and I saw what happened at the fence post. I won't be hearing it described otherwise in my presence." Eleanor's color had changed. Something behind her careful social expression had gone very still, like a mechanism that had encountered an obstruction. Gideon turned. Mary was standing at the sideboard with a serving dish she could now not have identified, looking at him with the expression of someone who has been braced for impact for so long that its absence is its own kind of shock. He crossed the room to her in the same 8 even strides he had crossed the yard that first morning, and the dinner table watched in the particular silence of people understanding that they are witnessing something that will be described for years. "Mary," he said it, the way he had said it at the orchard fence, quietly, with the weight of a man who had been thinking about it for longer than the moment suggested. "I would very much like to marry you, if you'll have me." She looked at him. The room did not exist. Eleanor did not exist. "You've read 4 pages of my agricultural argument," he said. "I'd like to read the rest, for the remainder of my life, ideally." The serving dish was trembling slightly. She set it down. "Yes," she said. "All right."
The word yes, it turned out, was the beginning of a great deal of work. Gideon's lawyers arrived from St. Louis 10 days later, 2 precise, unhurried men who carried leather cases and asked questions with the patient thoroughness of people who understood that the truth was always in the documents if you knew which documents to request. Mary had given Gideon the 9 letters from the pantry the morning after the dinner, laying them on the orchard fence between them without preamble or explanation.
He had read them with the same focused stillness he brought to everything, and when he finished, he had looked at her with an expression she was learning to read, the one that meant he was mastering something he did not intend to perform in front of anyone. He had sent for the lawyers the following morning. Thomas Harthaway's will had not, as Eleanor had represented to Mary and to the county probate office, left the farm and its holdings to Eleanor in trust for the household. It had left the farm, the land, the orchard, and the entirety of Thomas's accumulated holdings directly to Mary, with a modest provision for Eleanor contingent on her remaining in residence as a dependent rather than a proprietor. The version of the will that had passed through probate was not this version. The lawyers were interested in that discrepancy. The probate clerk, it emerged, had a cousin who had once worked for Eleanor's family in Virginia. The lawyers were interested in that too. Eleanor left the Harthaway house on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week that Mary had found the letters, and Mary noted the symmetry without finding it either satisfying or insufficient. It was simply the shape of how it ended. Eleanor departed with her personal belongings and her daughters and the particular rigid composure of a woman who has lost but refuses to perform losing. She did not speak to Mary directly. At the gate, she paused and looked back at the house with an expression that Mary, watching from the kitchen window, found she could not entirely interpret, not remorse exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, something that might have been remorse if Eleanor had been a woman built differently. Helena paused at the gate longer than her mother. She looked at Mary across the yard with her mother's eyes, in a face that had always been, beneath the performance, somewhat kinder than Eleanor intended. She opened her mouth once and closed it. Then she nodded, a small, precise nod, and followed her mother down the road. Lydia did not look back at all. The wedding was in October, when the orchard was past its harvest and the bottomland had turned its particular shade of gold that Mary had been watching from the kitchen window for 6 autumns. Gideon's aunt Cassandra arrived from Cincinnati 2 weeks before the ceremony and installed herself in the guest room with the brisk authority of a woman who has been waiting to be useful and intends to make the most of it. She was sharp-tongued and warmly perceptive and took an immediate inventory of Mary that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with her mind, and within 3 days had declared her the most sensible woman she had met west of the Ohio River, which Mary understood was the highest available compliment. Mary's hair had begun to grow back by then, a soft, close crop that she had initially hidden under a cap and had gradually, incrementally stopped hiding. Gideon had never once looked at it with anything other than the same straightforward attention he turned on everything about her, and she had found, slowly and with the characteristic resistance of a deeply held habit, that she was beginning to borrow his perspective on the subject. She stood in her father's orchard on the morning of her wedding in the October light and looked at the land that was hers, the wheat fields implementing her drainage theory, the grafted trees heavy with the last of the season's fruit, the long, flat bottomland her father had worked honest and left to her in trust for exactly this kind of morning. The woman Eleanor had constructed from 6 years of patient diminishment did not stand there. She had been left behind somewhere, gradually, in the hours before dawn and the orchard conversations and the 4 pages of agricultural argument that a man had asked her to write because her thinking was worth reading. Thomas Harthaway's daughter stood there instead, whole and present and entirely her own. Gideon found her between the grafted trees, as she had known he would. He stood beside her and looked at the land with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood what he was looking at. "Ready?" he said. She considered the orchard, the wheat fields, the long golden reach of the bottomland in the October light. "I've been ready for quite some time," she said.
If Mary's story moved you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or reduced to less than you are, then this story was written for you. Like, if you believe quiet strength is the most powerful kind. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no one gets to write your worth but you. Subscribe so you never miss the next chapter, because the best part of every frontier is what gets built after the hard season ends. And drop a comment below. What was the moment that changed everything for you?